These are the books that my daughter is very smart and she thinks about things. And so, one way I wanted to help her, and this is something my own did with me, I was a very independent minded child. My dad always tells a story about how I got into an argument at the age of like 3 and I won because I turned out to be right. And he is just like, I can't believe that I have to argue with this little kid. And this little kid is not backing down in the slightest. He is completely convinced that he's right. And then he found out that I was right. And that was always just the sort of kid I was. And so my dad realized that actually I was going to be a bit more difficult than some of his other children because a lot of children, whatever their behavior is, kind of take it for granted that their parents know everything and just listen to them. And it's like, oh, yeah, if I ask a question to my parents, they'll just tell me whatever I need to know. And I was just not like that. I was very independent. I like to challenge people a lot. I never really stopped being like that. I gradually became a little less disagreeable. My first word was no. And it was very useful. You know, I ended up studying philosophy in my undergraduate and graduate studies, and that is the sort of person who ends up doing that kind of thing. Uh, so my dad was like, well, how do I speak to this child? How do I influence him when really authority just doesn't work on me? It just doesn't work at all. And he realized, he's like, well, I'm just going to have to give him good material and let him think about it for himself and figure it out. I'm going to have to just give him the vocabulary. I'm going to have to give him the things to make him think about it. I'm going to have to just give him good stuff that he can really sink his teeth into and let him run with it. And that's what he did. And I think that was actually a brilliant solution. My dad had read, and the book on parenting that my dad had read was called Know Your Child. And that was its major advice. Understand the distinctive differences between your children and use different approaches to them. And the verse that he was always talked about was understand the way the bow is bent. And, that was my dad's way of approaching things, was saying, you can't just have your approach set and your decision set, your philosophy set. You may have your goals set, but your child is an individual. You need to get to know that individual and you have to learn how to work with them. And so that's how my dad worked with me. He realized he could never force me into any path or force me into any kind of thought, but that if he provided me the materials and the questions and the vocabulary, I would work my way through it myself, and he trusted that I would figure it out. And so I've tried to apply some of that with my own kids. And part of that is why I did give this to my daughter. I wanted her to have the language, the vocabulary to be able to think about these questions, to be able to process them, and just on her own terms. Like I just said, here's a book, read it, and we didn't talk about it over much. We talked about it some. I could tell it made her think. It made her raise questions. And she understood actually a lot of it. But I didn't push her to take any specific actions or draw any specific conclusions. And I did it also because I could see she was approaching that age where she began to become conscious. She was developing the burden of conscience, like realizing, oh, I'm a particular person. I can do things that push me one way or another. I have a responsibility for who I am and for what I do. Like, not just in the I'm trying not to get in trouble with my parents' way, but in this larger existential sense. She was growing into the moral burden that humans possess. And I wanted her to have something to help her think about it. And so I'm not going to go in the story over much, but she became a Christian this summer. And one of the things that was very helpful was the fact that she had read these books and had a background for thinking about the subject. Like, she wasn't, apart from what you pick up in life, as kids, you're not always paying attention to everything that's going on, and you get driven somewhere. This is kind of how life is when you're a kid. You get driven somewhere, you're not paying attention to it as if you were going to have to drive it yourself. You're just like, yeah, we're going here. We go by these familiar things, but I'm not overly concerned about it because, we just end up at grandma's. But I think these books are very useful for sort of furnishing the mind and furnishing the mind in a fun and creative way, in a way that it has a lot of technical complexity, isn't as didactic as some versions, but actually puts it in the form of just like a story, an engaging story, and a story full of fear and danger and joys and ups and downs. It tells the story of life. And so for me, in a way, this was a way to say, is this a journey that you want to undertake? Do you feel the burden? Are you feeling the weight of the burden that Christian was feeling? And I remember just asking her and just opening up and just reading something to her, reading a passage and just being like, is this how you're feeling right now? Is this the way you're feeling? And she just said, yes, this is exactly how I'm feeling. And I said, well, what do you want? Do you want to feel this way? And then we read another passage. We said, okay, what's the bridge between these things? What's the journey? And so that was good. It was good for helping her understand what was in her mind. It was good for helping her understand what she wanted and what she thought. So I am very positive on the ability of literature and good stories to have an immense influence on children, on the way you furnish their minds, and that you need to be both careful about that, but also proactive about it. And that there's an enormous amount of good that can be done, an enormous amount of learning, and there's ways to do it that are engaging through these stories and that aren't just didactic talking about points, but are couching them within the story of your life or someone's life. Because it's not all just intellectual questions, it's actually life. It's not like Christian spends the whole book sitting around just reading and thinking about it or arguing with people. He journeys. He goes through swamps and gets lost. He's in pits of despair. He finds places of rest. He finds people who offer to help him, and some of them are trying to help him, and some of them are not. And so that's just a part of what I really enjoy about this kind of story, is the way that it actually does make it a story. And of course, some books lean heavier on the story elements, some books lean harder on the message elements. This is a dream that is, this is, like I said, this is like the first English novel. So, this is a very early work. Learning, people are taking different approaches, and so it's a little less novel-y than some novels. This isn't Jane Austen, but it's still readable. It's still fun. So I would say if you have a chance, give it a try. Pick these books up. They're well worth it. They're fun books to keep around, whichever one you choose. And that's all for today. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.